everybody. A few housekeeping items before we get started. You can ask questions in the chat, and we will be answering them throughout and at the end. And also in the chat, we'll be sharing some relevant links for you in the presentation, so look out for those. And when we're done, you'll be emailed a recording of this, as well as our home sellers guide. And you can reach out to any of us to answer questions that you don't want to ask publicly. So I am Tina Fallon. I work with Victoria Alexander, who is the owner of Realty Collective. That's Victoria's picture there in the slideshow. And one of the reasons I'm doing this instead of Victoria's, I do a lot of work with sellers, and I really love this process. I also really love working with Rashidah. So this is Rashidah Siddiqui. She is a real estate attorney and all-around problem solver for the complicated things that are involved in selling a home in New York. And we're basically your coaches, your therapists, and your sounding board to help you get through the emotional roller coaster of selling a home. When this is over, we're going to send you our home sellers handbook, and I'm sure we have your addresses so that we can, we'll be emailing it to your the address you registered for this with. If you needed to go someplace else, just let us know. And then handing over to Rashidah.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rashidah Siddiqui. I'm a partner at Serpico, and Siddiqui PC. I have been practicing real estate for the past 19 years and represented plenty of sellers in that process over the years. I'm licensed in both New York and New Jersey. And, just here to give like my insight on preparing a seller for that process, because what you want to do at the end of the day is sell your property and have it go as smoothly as possible. So knowing what documents you need to have in advance, knowing your time frames, knowing things that you need to plan for is what I'm here to do as your attorney, and also explain to you the contract of sale and kind of the terms that you're going to be aware of when you're selling your property. So look forward to giving that insight, and let's go ahead.
All right. So we'd like to start with just some basic questions about why sell now. So obviously there's a lot of reasons to sell your home. You may be wanting to trade up to a bigger space or downsize into something smaller. And you may want to be taking advantage of the market that we are in right now, which has been a bit of a seller's market pretty recently. So most property that you own right now is going to be a fairly high demand category, some in more high demand than others. And then some people are selling because they're ready to move out of New York City. And some may be selling because they've already moved out of New York City and are and have property that they're ready to part with. We are, and we have been, in a seller's market for the past year or so, as people were shuffling back into homes in New York as the pandemic started to normalize, I guess. But right now, one of the things that we've seen and that we're going to talk about during this particular session that we haven't spoken about recently is this recent very dramatic uptick in mortgage interest rates. And that is having an effect on the market that we're in right now in this nanosecond. So what was a very hot seller's market even a month ago has cooled off considerably. It's still a great time to be selling, but it's something to be aware of as you put your home on the market or as you consider putting your home on the market. So things to consider when you're thinking about selling. The market has changed. So if you were waiting for springtime to sell, for example, because you wanted to wait till the weather was better, that's always a good time to be selling. But the fact that the interest rates have gone up is probably going to counterbalance that. But there's been encouraging news on the pandemic front. People are still moving back into New York, and we are still at a moment when there's historically very little inventory available. So any home priced properly is going to find an audience and a new owner in this market. But one of the other things that we want you to consider is, have you owned your property long enough to actually see a profit at the time of your sale? So we talk about a kind of break-even horizon. It is usually roughly 5 years home ownership, in part because the costs of buying and selling are so high in this city. The transaction costs are really high. I'm going to let Rashidah talk a little bit more about that when it's her turn. But that these 8% potentially for you and your closing costs, that's something that that can really take a bite out of your profit if you haven't really owned your property long enough. And Rashidah, can you talk a little bit about what that closing costs entail?
Yeah, so definitely one of the main things that you do want to consider, obviously, is what your costs are going to be. Because yes, you're going to be getting funds, hopefully back after everything kind of pans out. But in New York, as Tina had mentioned, is the closing costs can be pretty high. Um, Off the back, you have New York City and New York State transfer taxes. I tell everyone that the city and the state, they're going to take you either way, when you're purchasing or when you're buying, but they're going to get their cut of the deal. So you have seller pays the transfer taxes typically. You have first what we call is New York City transfer tax, and that is between either 1% or 1.425%. If you're in Westchester, or if you're in Nassau County or Suffolk County, you don't have New York City transfer taxes. But if you're in the 5 boroughs, you have that New York City transfer tax. You also have New York State transfer tax, and that's all over New York. So that's 0.4%, and that is based on your purchase price. So the New York City one is also based on the purchase price, which is the 1% if it's under 500,000, and it's 1.425% if it's over. So definitely you want to take those two items right there. You have New York City and New York State. Then you have your realtor commission. If you have a mortgage on the property, you have to pay off the mortgage. If you're selling in a co-op, one of the New York City, lots of co-ops. So you always want to find out, does your co-op have a flip tax? A flip tax is basically a percentage of your purchase price that you have to pay to the co-op. And that varies from different co-ops. It can be based on the number of shares, which I've seen, which is always good because then you know that's a set amount. Or it can be based on your purchase price, on your sales price. And, you know, so I've seen co-ops range from 1% if it's to 2%, 3%. If it's an HDFC co-op, it could be 10%. So it really depends on the type of co-op that you're selling. But once again, that's one of the factors you want to take into consideration, because it is another thing that you have to pay off at closing. So always check with your management company, check with your co-op board, find out if there's a flip tax. Hopefully you would have known, because the shareholders have to vote on a flip tax. But if you've been there for many years and you may have hasn't crossed your mind in a while, you want to check on that. And then you have like miscellaneous fees, like if you have a mortgage, you have to pay for recording the satisfaction of the mortgage. There's a title closer. So your miscellaneous fees may run to maybe another $1,000. But typically your main items are New York City, New York State transfer tax, realtor commission, paying off your mortgage, flip taxes if it's a co-op. And then things that you need to keep in the back of your head is capital gains. Lots of people bought their property maybe like the 80s, and now you're looking to sell it. So you went from this huge, now you're looking at that and you want to find out, is there capital gains? You don't have to pay it at closing, but when you file your taxes, you do have to pay it depending on, whether you have an exemption or not. So always want to speak to also an accountant. I always tell clients, when you're looking to sell your property, to see if you have capital gains, or if you, if there's an exemption that you can claim. Is it investment property? So you want to have those type of conversations with your realtor, with your attorney, and with your accountant.
Okay, great. Yeah, so moving on. Let's talk about whether your property is what people are looking for. So, New York, people want to live in New York for a lot of different reasons. Some people really want the amenities in their building. They want to have a roof deck. They want a gym. They want parking. Some people are really buying for location. One of the things we found during the pandemic was that a lot of people wanted to be close to Prospect Park, for example. They wanted to be able to get outside and be someplace where they weren't so close to other human beings. Some people now are really looking at moving into larger homes where there is a place where they can work from home in addition to having spaces for sleeping. And then there are outdoor space is something that became a big premium during the pandemic. Sometimes people are really looking for school performance. They want to be in a certain school district. We can't advise as to whether a school district is good or bad, but a lot of people will be buying specifically because they want their children to go to a certain school. And then you have the multifamily versus single family home. If you're selling an apartment or a co-op, that's one thing, but you may have some people who are looking to offset their expenses by having some income from an additional unit, so a two-family or more. And then parking again, something that was a big deal during the pandemic. A lot of people bought pandemic cars. They got pandemic puppies, they got pandemic cars, and parking is at a huge premium right now. And we have clients who just bought in a condo building on St. Mark's and 4th Avenue, where the self-park parking spaces alone, just the parking spaces right now, are selling for $250,000. That's in Brooklyn on 4th Avenue. So if you've got parking associated with your home, that is definitely something that today's buyers value, I would say even more than they did a couple of years ago.
$250,000 for a parking spot.
I know, it's crazy. So not everything has that. But if you're in a place that doesn't have great park, if you're in Park Slope, what are you gonna do? That's days, weeks of your life you spend driving around.
It does.
So, what is your time worth? And then one of the things that we do find is that people who have, right now we live in a time of pretty extreme income inequality, and people who have a lot of money, they've got all the money. And so for them, that $250,000 might not be that big a difference. I mean, obviously it wasn't, our clients didn't want that, but for other people that are willing to pay for convenience, you'd be surprised at what people will be willing to pay for.
Mm-hmm.
So then we like to we talk a lot of people out of selling their homes. So one of the issues in the next slide is, have you had your property long enough? So we talked about some of these in with Rashidah already, but when you're calculating all of those costs, this is something that you may say, you know what, I do want to leave the city, but I own a condo and I'm going to rent my condo out for a couple of years because there's not enough equity in it for me to make my money back. Or sometimes we just say, are you sure you really want to leave? Sometimes people feel pressure to sell because they hear about all of their neighbors are making so much money selling their homes. And you should never feel pressured to sell your home just because other people are doing it or because the market seems right. You really need to do what's right for you, what's right for your family. And in New York City, generally speaking, long-term hold of real estate is going to pay off one way or another over time, either by converting it to a rental property or making sure you've owned it long enough to be able to get your cash back out. I think the rest of that is we already covered. Okay. So do you have a plan for after you sell? Then this is a really important piece. And I think sometimes because real estate can move very quickly in the city, we really want to make sure that you have a plan for what you're going to do after you sell. And so we like to look at the whole process of selling as it is a giant transformation that you are going to go through. There's a transaction at the core of it. But other than that, there's a lot of prep. And then there's also a lot of resettling. And when you choose to sell a property, let's say that your life things come unstuck around the process of selling. And so sometimes people are selling homes and it changes where they're going to work, just because they're no longer anchored to this piece of property. And that's a really exciting time in people's lives for us to be a part of that kind of transformation. But it can be harrowing if you're not really prepared for it to go. And even if you are prepared, it can still be harrowing. So making sure you have a plan, even if that plan does change for what you're going to do after you sell. Because sometimes people are like, oh, my house is worth so much money, I'm going to sell it. But then if you're going to stay in New York, you're going to buy and sell in that same market, you're going to have those transaction costs again. You may find yourself with less than you had before, unless you're really careful how you go about it.
And then also just that, I know we have one there just about the timeline as
Yeah.
well. As you had indicated, things move pretty quickly in New York. I know other states it's also as well, but your contract is going to have a certain time frame for you to close. Typically, if you're looking at a house or a condo, it's a 60-day process, and you'll be surprised on how quickly 60 days flies by. If you're selling a co-op, it may be more of a 60 to 90-day process. And in the contract, it states that you have to be out of your property, and the property has to be delivered vacant and broom clean. So you have to make sure that that time frame also coincides in what you're planning on doing. Because if you list your property today and you find a buyer today, and you get multiple offers, which happens, and then you go into contract within a week, you're looking, you have to get out of your property and move into something else, whether you're going to be rental, whether you're moving out of state, or you're buying something else within that 60-day time period. And you also, if that's, or the more you know upfront, so you can speak with your attorney on your realtor and say, hey, I'm going to need longer than a 60-day because I'm purchasing something else. So can we put on or about 90-day closing? Or you speak with your attorney and say, hey, I'm buying and selling, so I need to have a post-possession clause, which means that you can close and sell and remain in the property for a certain amount of days after the closing. So all of these things you want to start thinking about, because you don't want to enter into contract and realize you don't have those protections, and you're going to have to leave on that day of the closing or the day before the closing, because they have to do that final walkthrough and make sure that you're out, out of the property. So always think about that time frame.
Yeah, that's one of the key things too, is you may feel like you are not in control of this process because there's so many other people's wants and needs that are tugging at it. And we try to have a really good plan going into it so that we know what your expectations and needs are. And we find you a buyer who's going to be able to satisfy those needs. Mm-hmm. So there may be somebody who comes in with a higher offer, but they need to move in 30 days. And you have a tenant who you need to get out, and you're not going to be able to pull that off. It's less expensive to take the lower price and not have to pay to get your tenant out, for example. So we really like to look at what the net value of the transaction is to you, not just in terms of your bottom line financially, but also what your personal needs are. And we ask you to be as frank and honest about those with us as we can be, because we don't want to put you, and we can avoid putting you in a position where you're feeling forced to move more quickly than you feel you need to, or than you can. So moving on from there. All right, so after you've taken all of those things into consideration, and you are ready to sell, it's time to assemble your team. And obviously that's why we're here. I would argue that even before you find a real estate agent, you may want to be talking to people about an attorney. Sometimes that's because you have a complicated sale that you need to make sure is going to be able to be marketed freely. Or sometimes it's just because it takes a little while to find somebody who you really can trust. So you definitely want to have a real estate attorney. I'm going to sell Rashidah for a second. You want a real estate attorney who is absolutely familiar with buying and selling in New York City. We can't be more clear about this. It is a very strange and particular place. For all the best reasons that we love it so much, but also as a place to do real estate. And so you really want somebody, you have a friend who's also a tax attorney and wants to help you out, that's not going to be the right thing to do. So you definitely need to get an experienced attorney, and an attorney who you feel is responsive to your needs. And somebody who you feel like you can be honest and clear with, and who is going to represent you and get this deal done. And similarly, you want a real estate broker. And a real estate broker, obviously, unless you're doing it for sale by owner, if you're doing for sale by owner, you still need an attorney. You will not be able to do that without a real estate attorney. But if you decide that you want your properties to be marketed more widely and you don't have the time and energy to sell it yourself, you would go to a real estate broker. And we have our own philosophy about how to work. We work really well with people who enjoy working with a small company. We're a small, independently owned, woman-owned, Brooklyn-based company. We don't do a massive amount of volume, so we do a lot of really hands-on work with people, and we do a lot of work with both first-time buyers and first-time sellers. So people who maybe feel like they want a little bit more personal attention as they go through this process. And we also really work in Brooklyn itself. So we are so familiar with the areas and the clients that we work with. And so we really know our market. And we don't do, we just like we're not also tax attorney. Rashida's not doing your taxes for you. We're not representing property in White Plains. We're not representing property even in Manhattan. We do sometimes, but very rarely. We're very focused on the kind of work we do, but talk to other people too and interview people. Do we talk about the interview part? I can't remember if that's in our notes.
I just also want to just say even as an attorney, one of the good things about having a broker as a seller is that they can vet your buyer. Because you come to the attorney, your attorney's not going to vet your buyer. That's not what you're hiring your attorney to do. Your attorney is going to be making sure that you're in contract and making sure that the terms of the contract, you understand that, and making sure the documents are being prepared for the closing and things like that. But you don't want to find a buyer that you sell by owner and you go into, they put in an offer, you accept it, and then you find out they're not qualified for their loan, or they have certain issues, or the broker is able to vet them through that process and also assist you with kind of the process of the walkthrough, making sure the property is ready for the closing. So these are things that your attorney is not going to be there for. I have a client that's selling a property, a co-op, and I keep on trying to tell her to get, especially for a co-op, to get a broker, because I can't advise her regarding, I'm not going to fill out the co-op application. That's not my job as an attorney. I can tell I try to assist, but that's not what you hired me for. This is the second buyer, and the first buyer had, financial problems, and was it going to be their buying it with the mother? And these are things that your broker will say, these are the things that the co-op is looking for. Is this buyer the right buyer, instead of waiting 30 to 60 days to find out no when you started over again? So really that broker is really kind of there to help you through that process and making sure that your buyer is qualified and helping you get to that part. So your attorney is looking at the paperwork and can guide you, but that's really not what your attorney's, the other parts of it is really your broker is kind of the holistic part of it as well.
I'll also say your attorney is not going to negotiate. Your real estate, your attorney is going to, send comments back and forth with the other attorney. It's not that you don't have, but when it comes down to negotiating the terms, it's really the real estate agents and the clients that are going to do that. And one of the things that I love to negotiate. Like, I find it's one of my favorite parts of the process. I think I love the give and take of it. I love getting the best possible deal for my clients. That gives me deep personal satisfaction. And so I think, and attorneys are mostly want to make sure that the deal's okay. So I'm here to be, I'm not going to say that I'm necessarily like too aggressive about it, but I love that part of the process, and I love representing my clients. I have a client, just to say, the thing that happened recently is that a client who had her house. She came to me and she was interviewing another broker as well. And when I told her what I wanted to list her apartment for, her house, she just thought that was just too much money. And I said, if we list it for less than this, people will think there's something wrong with the property, that this is not a number that I'm just like plucking out of the blue. This is really the market rate for this home. And so she got a little bit more comfortable with the idea of that. And, but I also said, we can wait until spring because you have a beautiful backyard, but just anecdotally, the feeling that we have right now is that if you go on the market in February, you're going to be the belle of the ball. There's no other houses in Park Slope on the market. And a lot of that I was thinking about today. I was like, it's just instinct. Like I've been doing this for 16 years, and I know what happens. I know what a market feels like. And it's a little bit hard to quantify, but I will say for my lovely client that even though she thought we priced it a little bit high, we ended up getting her $700,000 over her asking price, which is insane. And the people overpaid for it. But I was happy to take that overpayment for my client because she was a teacher. She worked her whole life as a teacher. And this was her whole pension. And she's going to live a really wonderful retirement in Tennessee and now Mexico, because she's going to be able to split her time between Mexico and Tennessee. So those are things that if she had put it on the market herself, not only would she have priced it lower than we had originally priced it, she wouldn't have had somebody there to really advocate for the property, get all those bids in, create the kind of environment that we needed to create so that she could get a number that was significantly higher than her asking price. I'm just like patting myself on the back about that, but it was crazy. That's a really unusual outcome. So I don't want to make set up expectations, but that's what a broker can do for you. So then the other things that we're talking about, so other things that we do for our clients is staging. So one piece of this is that you really want your property to tell a consistent story. So if you're selling a home, you want to minimize the friction basically between the story that you're telling and the one that your buyers are receiving. So if we're selling we're selling a 2-family house and there's a tenant in place. And that tenant is going to be, that tenant hasn't decided yet whether or not they want to move. We really want to get that sorted before we put the home on the market. Or if you have somebody who's been living in your house and their furniture isn't quite doing the right job selling the home to the kind of buyer that you want or the price that you want to get, then we stage homes for our clients. We're a small company, so we're able to do that as part of the overall commission. We don't charge additional for the use of our staging materials. But those are the kinds of things that can really make a big difference. You want the photos, the floor plan, the copy, and then you want the whole process to tell the same story. You want your buyers to feel confident that you've answered these questions in advance, you've addressed them. And if there is anything, I'll throw it back to Rashidah. So part of this comes down to your attorney and your attorney doing a quick check to make sure that there are no open violations on your property or anything that's going to slow the process down, because we want to get people to fall in love with the photographs, and then we want them to show up and we want it to smell great, because you can't smell a photograph. We want it to smell great. We want it to feel great. We don't want it to be too cold or too hot. We don't want it to be too noisy. We just want them to go in and sort of ease themselves into buying your home. So, but Rashidah, can you talk a little bit about the legal issues?
Yeah, so I always, if a client is looking to sell their property, I always ask them, you're already probably start packing like your documents and things like that, but you want to look for the documents that you got from when you purchased the property. Do you have what we call as your owner's policy, which is an insurance policy that you got that says there were no violations or anything on the property when you purchased the property. They had the certificate of occupancy. So anything from when you originally purchased the property is helpful. If you don't have it, not a big deal, but it's always helpful to have a copy of your deed, a copy of your owner's policy. If it's a co-op, do you have your stock certificate? Do you have your proprietary lease? If you don't, and you have a mortgage on the property, you just want to confirm that they have it, or we will contact them to get those documents for the closing. We also, myself as an attorney, I believe in prevention versus being reactive. So I look up the property and I look to see, are there any open violations with the Department of Buildings or HPD, which is Housing Preservation Department. I look up to see if there's any open permits. Maybe you did you did some renovation on your property, and that contractor that you thought signed off everything and got all the things from the Department of Buildings never did that. So now there's this open electrical application or this open plumbing application that's still on the property. So these are things that you want to know in advance, because it's going to take some time for you to clear it up. And you don't want to be in contract and then finally find out that this is open on the property, which now is going to delay your closing maybe 60 to 90 days, or maybe you're now going to have to renegotiate the terms with your buyer, or put money in escrow, which is just additional costs that you don't want to have. So a good real estate attorney is going to be able to look up the property and look up the various departments. We can't look up sidewalk violations. We can't look up fire department violations. But I typically ask clients, hey, did you get notices? Do you remember if, sanitation? Is there an ECB, which is, you put the garbage out on the wrong day and they gave you a ticket and you forgot about it? Even things like parking tickets come up. So, that parking ticket that you never paid now becomes a judgment. Certain things we can clear up at closing, but it's always, once again, prevention is better than being reactive, because you want to make sure, hey, I got my ducks in a row and I'm just going to get my funds at the closing, versus having to pay double the amount to clear up a violation or clear up a judgment and things like that. But the more information you have, especially for when you purchase the property, if you refinance, did you pay off the mortgage, satisfactions? Keep all of your documentation. I know people like to start shredding, scan if you're going to shred and put it aside. But always keep as much documentation, because the more you have, that's better. I had a client that was selling a property, and an old mortgage that they thought was paid off, the satisfaction was never recorded. And she went through her documents and we were able to track down. And it was, good thing she kept very good records, because we were able to clear it up. But it's always good in advance. And we were able to do that prior to her entering into contract, because I was able to look up and I saw that there was this open mortgage, and she said, I don't have a mortgage. And I was like, well, there's a mortgage that's still on the property. Did you pay it off? And she went and found her records. So whatever owner's policy, stock certificates, copies of documents, your deed, as I said, any permits or anything that you took have on the property. If you combine, put a deck, decks and things like that. Some people don't get permits for that, but you want to at least let your attorney know. So that's also, even if you don't have the paperwork, let your realtor and let your attorney know, hey, I put up this wall in my co-op unit and I didn't get the board's approval. It's not really a 2-bedroom, it's a 1-bedroom, or it's a cellar and I use it as a bedroom, but it's really not a legal bedroom. So all these things that we can plan on, or we can put provisions in the contract for, the more you let us know, the more we can prepare for that.
Yeah, I think that's really important, is that the more we know, we can find a buyer for almost any circumstance. That's not going to be the problem. But the question is, which buyers are you going to be appealing to? So in some cases, well, we don't have this documentation, this is an open buyer. You may be only then looking for a cash buyer or only an investor, and you may have to take a lower price for it than you would if you were marketing it to a broader base. But that still might be the right answer for you. And so we really want to work on whatever's the right answer for you. And that's why being clear about all of this stuff in the beginning, although it sounds like a lot of homework, it is a lot of homework, but it's going to make the process of soliciting buyers much more easy, and it's going to help us be more accurate in terms of our marketing. So when we keep coming back to this idea of storytelling, is that, what is the story that we're telling? Are we telling this is it's a luxury home with every possible amenity? Are we saying this is a really smart investment? Are we saying this is a cozy starter home? Or are we saying, look, you know what? It's not great, but it's going to be good for somebody. You bring your contractor and you can fix it up. As long as we're clear about what story we're telling, we can build a marketing plan around that. So those are the things that I think we just want to make sure that that we are all clear about. As I was saying, that we don't want to we don't always have the same outcome, right? Like we're always going to get through, we're going to get it done, we're going to get the deal done. But the clearer we all are about what our expectations are and how we've made our plan, then we play our plan, and usually the results are what we expected. So when you're considering offers, so let's say we solicit our buyers, we've decided what story we're going to tell, we put it out there. So real estate agents in New York, for the most part, are part of the Real Estate Board of New York. It's not specifically a multiple listing service, but it really does kind of function as a multiple list service. And any member of REBNY, so our company may be small, but when we list your property for sale, it goes out into all the same networks that somebody from Compass or Corcoran or Douglas Elliman is using. They may have their own internal software that they use for managing things, but we're all pulling from the same, we're all submitting to the same basic services. So we put it out there, and it goes out to StreetEasy and Trulia and Zillow, which are all one company. And it also goes out into all of the MLSs. So we send the property out. People start getting in touch with us right away. So sometimes they reach out through their brokers, sometimes they reach out to us directly, and we schedule our showings, we get people through, we've been really clear, our paperwork is good, we know we're gonna be able to move pretty quickly, and so we start asking for offers right away. And those offers come in, we share them with you, and then it's time to consider the various offers that you're receiving. And I'll send this to Rashidah because I think that it's really important to have your attorney on board before you accept an offer too.
Yeah, definitely. When considering offers, one of the things, timing, closing dates. Are you, once again, I keep on harping on that, are you ready to move right away? Is that buyer, needs to close within 30 days or 60 days? Also contingencies, are they getting a mortgage? Is it a 95% mortgage, a 80% mortgage? Is it all cash transaction? Is it truly an all cash where they can't say, well, we're putting in all cash, but we're going to get financing. So I'm getting financing, but it's not contingent. So these are things that are going to go into the contract of sale. And you want to understand how that affects your timing wise and the ability for them to back out of the contract. I just had a seller, and one of the things he asked is, once we sign the contract, what are the steps for them to either back out and get the return of their deposit? And that's a really good question, because, if they have a mortgage contingency, then if they're not able to get the mortgage, they have a right to cancel the contract and get the return of it. So if you have an all cash buyer, you have one with a contingency, you want to make those, take those into consideration when you're doing your offer. And Tina and her team will they'll walk you through that process and weigh the different various offers as well. As is condition, is this, are they going to be gut renovating? Do the roof is about to, there's issues with the roof or there's been leaks? If you're selling in a co-op or a condo, the buyer's attorney has to do due diligence. And, you want to disclose, maybe there's a reason you're leaving because there's a noisy neighbor upstairs, or, there's lots of leaks, or there's upcoming maintenance increases. So the more you have, tell your attorney and your realtor, we can put provisions into the contract to protect you and give disclosures as well.
Yeah, and that I think is really the variety. So there's the price that people are offering, and sometimes somebody will come in with a very low offer, and then once you counter them, they come right up. So we always counter every offer that comes in, because I'm going to negotiate every single offer to its best possible place, and then have you evaluate the one against the other. But and the first offer, we always say take the first offer very seriously. Sometimes people get a really great first offer, and then they're like, oh great, then now they're going to just come rolling in. And if you don't take that first offer seriously, that person may move on to something else that hits the market later in the week, and in the meantime you're waiting for somebody to come up with something that's as good as you got that first time. So we like to usually your first offer is from somebody who's very educated about the market, who's probably been outbid on something else and is ready to move quickly. And if we can if we can get that person and their attorney talking to Rashidah quickly, then the sooner you get into contract, the better, because really the deal killer for everything is time. If somebody waits long enough, something can happen, and we find that they're always most eager right at the beginning, and you want to be able to take advantage of the momentum that you have when your home first comes on the market. So having all of our paperwork ready, knowing what you need to get out of it, and then taking those first buyers seriously is one good way to get a good result.
Yeah. And just to go that also, once you get that offers accepted and the realtor sent out that deal sheet to your attorney, things are moving pretty quickly. So the more of those documents that I told you that you should start thinking about putting together you have already, the faster your contract goes out, because your attorney wants to make sure the names on the deed, are they correct? Or there's a name on the stock certificate. Is that correct? Is your maintenance up to date? So they get your latest maintenance statement, your latest mortgage statement, your owner's policy. If your attorney's already looked up the property for violations, we know we don't have to worry about that. Or if there is, we know we can put a provision into the contract that there are violations and they're taking a subject to that. So the quicker your contract typically goes out if you're selling within 24 hours after that deal sheet, once your attorney has all the information. But if your attorney doesn't have all that updated information, it may take longer for your contract to go out.
Right. And in the meantime, something else can kind of turn their heads, and they might find some, or one of the other things that we found is that they were the backup buyer on something else. And the person who won that bidding war has decided not to proceed. And now they have a chance to go back and buy something else that they had been interested in before they came to see yours. So all of those are reasons why we just want to make sure that we're moving as smoothly as possible. And if there are things, like if you don't have a survey, just let us know you don't have a survey. And we can let them know that they don't have a survey and they're going to have to do the survey. Or if you don't have a certificate of occupancy, it doesn't mean you can't sell. It just means we need to know that ahead of time so that we're not scrambling looking for something that doesn't exist. All right. Okay, and then we're still taking into consideration COVID-19. One of the things that we've seen is that, there's an uptick in cases and suddenly businesses are shutting down. It's something just to be aware of. And there's different things that we can do in terms of the agreement to make sure. So one of the things that people have been concerned about is, if you lose your job and you have a financing contingency, your bank will probably not underwrite that loan if you lose your job. So do you feel like the person who's purchasing your home with a financing contingency has a secure enough job that if there is an uptick in the virus or a downturn in the, is that person a mortgage originator? Because their job might be in danger. So those are things that you definitely want to take into consideration. And then we move into due diligence, which is largely at this point the role of the buyer's attorney.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, just for the due diligence, it goes back to you as a seller, just making sure either you've given all of the information to your realtor or you've contacted the management company to get all the information, because the buyer's attorney has to do what we call that due diligence, which is reviewing all of the paperwork for the co-op or the condominium. And that can take a while depending on how quickly they get those documents. So, and the management company being on board to answer questions and review appointments. And those things are outside of your control as a seller. But if you have a relationship with the management company, maybe you can say, hey, I got a buyer and the attorney's probably going to be contacting you. Can you make this a priority? I know some management companies don't care, and they say, hey, we have a strict 5 to 7 day turnaround time and we're not going to do anything before that. But, depending on the size of your building, it's depending on your relationship, that due diligence, but getting your offering plan, getting those type of things. So if you don't have it and your realtor doesn't have it, and now it's going to take your management company a week or two to get it, that's a week and two that you've lost from when your offer was accepted. And the buyer's attorney has to do due diligence. There's no way around it. So you want to make sure that they get those documents in time for the closing. And COVID-19 considerations, I would say one of the things that has come out of this is as far as, signing contracts electronically. It's much easier as a seller. The buyer can sign it electronically. As a seller, you can sign it electronically. Your attorney can send you a link, whether it's HelloSign, DocuSign, all these variations of signing the contracts electronically. So you don't have to meet in person. Your attorney is going to be holding the money in escrow. So a lot of times it's done via wire on the buyer's side. For the closing, checks are still being issued, and I actually still prefer bank checks because there's so much wire fraud going out that's happening that it's a nightmare as attorneys with escrow accounts. So we really, even though they're like, oh, just send us a wire, there's a lot that goes behind the scenes with wires that are a nightmare. So bank checks are always preferably, but if you can't attend the closing, you want to make sure your attorney knows so that power of attorneys can be prepared. For your I guess the funds from your closing that gets to you in time. So you always want to make sure planning ahead and having those conversations are what's needed.
So you've done all that, and now we're going to get ready to close the deal. So one of the things that we as a real estate agent are responsible for is you want to make sure that you are delivering the home in the condition that was agreed to at the time of the contract signing. So sometimes there'll be something where there's an issue where you have an appliance that's not working, and you agree to address that before the final walkthrough. Or there's a leak that you've discovered. But if we've disclosed all of that ahead of time and we have an as-is agreement, there are some things that you don't necessarily have to do. But generally speaking, you can't really have mechanical issues with the building because then the bank will not lend. So we want to make sure to go through before the final walkthrough, make sure that everything that needed to be addressed has been addressed. And then also that there aren't any new problems that have occurred in the interim. I don't know if you recall last fall, late summer, when we had those two huge floods. There were a number of properties that we had that were in contract that had to be re-inspected actually after that. And it was a big scramble for the attorneys and everything because they had to push closings back. But sometimes something, there's an act of God that happens and you have to address that. But we will hopefully have all of that handled before we do the final walkthrough, which is usually done the day before or the morning of the closing. And so we also want to be really frank with you about that. And there's certain things that we can do, like if we need to replace some batteries in your smoke detectors. Those are a lot of things that we can do to help out with that if you're too busy or away, just to get those things done. So we've done that. We've finished. We've gone through our walkthrough, and your attorney is going to take you through to the end.
Yeah. So the schedule of the closing, I always say it's like a juggling act. Because closings are done in person. We're back to that, which I actually like. I mean, there's very few there's some that's still done slightly remotely, but most attorneys now are back to in person just because it makes our lives a lot easier. And your attorney will coordinate with you. And if you, as a seller, your part of the actual closing is maybe 15 to 20 minutes of signing documents. The majority is going to be on the buyer's side. So you don't necessarily have to be at the closing. A lot of sellers do like to be at the closing because you're selling your property, you want to turn over your keys. But if it's a situation where your schedule doesn't, permit you to attend, or you're moved out of the property, or you've moved out of state or things like that, you can give your attorney power of attorney to sign the documents on your behalf, or you can meet your attorney in advance and pre-sign the documents a week before the closing or a couple of days before the closing so that they have everything in hand. And that's the attorney's job. The attorney's going to schedule with the buyer, with the co-op attorney, with the payoff attorney, with the title closer. So there's, depending on the type of transaction, it can be maybe 7 or 8 different parties that they're trying to schedule for the same day and same time. But your attorney is the one that's going to be in conjunction with the buyer's attorney scheduling that closing. And then it's coordinating with you whether you're going to attend in person, whether you're going to give power of attorney, and making sure that you're vacating the premises. I always want to stress the walkthrough. My preference is you don't want to do a walkthrough right before the closing, because if something comes up, it does not give you enough time as a seller to give your attorney a heads up for what's going on, especially now where even management companies, they want closings to happen within an hour or two, and they start charging you if you're taking longer than that. And a lot of times they don't want to discuss any walkthrough issues at the closing. So you want to make sure those type of things, you have enough time for your buyer so you want to vacate in time so that the buyer can come and do the walkthrough. And if something comes up, you have enough time to get a person in there to fix it, or figure out, maybe I'll give them a credit so I don't have to deal with the escrow and a headache after the closing that's going to turn into a $500 issue, not turns into a $1,000 issue. So these are things that you want to have a discussion with and make sure that you're out of the property in time for them to do that walkthrough as well. But at the end of the day, you get your keys, the attorney gives you your check, and it's a happy occasion. And everyone is, great to, get you to that closing, from that first time when you put it on the market to 60, 90, 30 days afterwards, that you're finally getting those keys and moving on to your next chapter in your life.
So that's it. I know it's a huge amount of information to process all at once, but that's one of the reasons why we're going to share the rest of our resources with you, our seller's handbook, and we encourage you to schedule a call either with Realty Collective or with Rashidah to get this process rolling and to answer any specific questions that we maybe didn't get to in the presentation. And we still have a few minutes left. If you have any questions you want to add to the chat, that we'd be happy to address. And but if you'd rather have those conversations in private, happy to do it that way too. I just want to say I had a walkthrough last week where there was a leak where there had never been a leak before. I've been showing this place since last summer. We had a deal fall through because somebody didn't get their financing. We had a great other deal that we finally got to back up. It was finally closing last week. And there was this mystery leak just appeared. And it's a building, somebody in the building will be able to address it. It's going to be fine, but my seller ended up having to give a $3,000 concession because the contractor came and said, okay, well, I think this is what it might cost to fix it. And at the end of the day, we didn't have time to get it done, and it was just easier to give the concession. Okay, so any suggestions on how long a tenant should be given to vacate a premises?
Well, there's actually regulated by law as well. So if you have a month-to-month, there's the new tenant laws. So if you have a tenant, whether it's a month-to-month or whether they're if they're month-to-month, at minimum, depending on how long they've been month-to-month, whether it's over a year, I believe now you have to give them 60 days notice, not just your regular 30-day notice. And if they've been month-to-month for longer than, if they had a lease and now they're month-to-month, but it's been more than 2 years, I believe it's a 90-day notice that you have to give them. So if they're under a lease, you want to see when the lease ends, and does your lease say how long you have to give them notice to vacate as well if you're selling your property. But if there's no lease, you definitely want to see 30. I think somebody said 30, but I was wondering, 30 days used to be the norm if it's month to month, but they recently, as I said, they changed the tenant laws. So even a 30-day notice may not be sufficient. So you always want to check with the landlord tenant attorney, because I believe it depends on how long they've actually been living in the property. So if they've lived there for longer than 1 year, you may have to give them more than 30 days. I believe it's either 60 days. And if it's been there for more than 2 years, even if they're month to month, you may have to give them 90 days notice.
That said, we can also show a home with a tenant in place and say that it can be delivered vacant as long as we accommodate those 60 to 90 days in the showing and then contract period. So I know some people don't want to have their home be vacant. They don't want to carry it without the rental income. So there are always ways that we can work around a tenant in place, particularly if you have a tenant who has like gorgeous furniture and makes the place look fantastic, that's always a bonus. But even if it's just, I think most people are understanding that a tenant is not going to keep a home as nicely as a owner is. And so, so they'll take that into consideration when evaluating the quality of the rental unit in the home. I think the other thing about selling with a tenant in place is that I know we've shown property where there's a tenant who doesn't want to leave, and then who can stand around and make it very hard for you to show. This is, I mean, there's like horror stories about this, which hopefully is not going to apply, but people who try to prevent the home from being sold. And if that's something that you're anticipating, that you have a tenant who's not going to go quietly, that's something that we should know ahead of time and have a plan for. There's always a plan. We just need to know what we're dealing with. Any other questions? Well, we're right at 6:30. So thank you so much for joining. Thanks, Rashidah. Thanks, Victoria, for letting me do this. I love doing the Selling in Brooklyn class. And I hope we will hear from you all soon.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Yeah, enjoy this beautiful sunny, except for cold weather.
Cold. I know.
Cold, but it's sunny. At least it's sunny.
Yes. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.